Our guest today is one of the best known names in the arts and indeed in arts education. Jude Kelly was born in Liverpool and went on to study drama at the University of Birmingham. Since then, she spent her time running a number of arts organisations throughout the country, including the West Yorkshire Playhouse. She's now Artistic Director of the South Bank Centre, and she also chairs the Education and Culture Committee of Olympics 2012. Jude, looking back at your background, I suppose you had a sort of background in education of the 1950s, 1960s, which is familiar to some people. Very supportive family, very high aspirations for you. Mm-hmm. But you yourself were of that group, was the first generation, first people in your family to go to university. So where did that drive and energy come from?
Well, you're right in saying that my parents, neither of whom went to university, felt very strongly that their 4 daughters should have equal opportunities, both in terms of sexually equal opportunities, you know, as girls, and also, you know, they both believed that education was going to be the key to liberation, which in fact that was really the strength, the feeling that period had, wasn't it? The health, welfare,
That's right.
Education.
That was the way out for them.
Absolutely. But the ingredient that I sort of bumped into was creativity and the arts. And I say bumped into it because actually I was sent to ballet when I was 5 because the doctor said I had flat feet. And my sister, who's an actress, was sent to elocution because she had a lisp. So actually, in some respects, the route into arts at that first level was via health. But the immediate thing that happened to me was that I felt that dancing brought out a part of me that I just never found anywhere else up until that point.
But it had to have come from more than just the normal childhood joining of the ballet company. I mean, was there arts and creativity? Was that a strong strand at home, or the school you went to? Was it very much treasured there as part of the curriculum?
I don't think it was driven from the home, except in the sense that, you know, my parents were encouraging of anything that we did. And I don't remember at my primary school having any strong sense that the arts were particularly important. But by the time I got to my secondary school, then I started to have a real sense that my enthusiasm, my energy had somewhere to go. And in fact, I mean, very specifically, by the time I got to 15, I was unruly and difficult and temperamental and all the things that, you know, that adolescents can be, but very much so. And I could have really gone in a very different direction, I think, in my life. I could have had a lot of troubles. But my head teacher, Mr. Pobjoy in Liverpool, basically said, look, there's the school hall. You obviously want to do something. You're interested in drama. Take it over at lunchtime and put your energy there. And I did. I formed a sort of drama club with a number of friends. And it was the making of me, really, because I felt as if my excitement about making up stories and putting them on for people, which actually I've been doing in the back garden when I was 5, was given legitimacy. And it's the legitimacy that really matters, I think.
But that sort of doing something, I suppose, what we now call extracurricular activities, sort of running a theatre group during the lunchtime. What about the rest of the curriculum in school? Was your school life split into, well, I'm not sure I quite like what's going on in school lessons, but I don't half enjoy what I'm able to do at lunchtime after school. Was it as divided as that, or is that a bit too harsh?
I loved drama. We did drama at school. I loved English. You know, I'm a very typical arts person in that respect, and I found the teaching of maths and science, the method of teaching, I found so antithetical.
I want to come on to that a little later on, because it's something you've written a lot about.
And so, you know, and I'm obviously, you know, intelligent, I'm literate, I'm numerate, I'm all of these things, and I'm actually very analytical, but for some reason I couldn't connect with what I now understand, this wonderful creative world of science and technology. I couldn't connect at all. But, and I've always been very galvanised by communities making connections. And so I think not only did I have this creative drive, but the sort of moral proposition that came from my family and my community, that society mattered, that neighbourhood mattered. I think this moral proposition joined with my creative sort of sensibility.
In terms of groups and working together,
yeah,
and
feeling
things.
That arts was for everyone. And I became really very passionate about this idea that if I was excited by story making or visual arts or whatever, then shouldn't everybody feel that they have the potential to be excited?
It's interesting you say that, because I mean, arts for everyone is something that's become perhaps a more used phrase in the last decade. But we were at secondary school at roughly the same time. But I remember quite clearly that there was a separate group that were the arts lot or the theatre lot. Mm-hmm. And I suppose of any subject area, they tended to be more separate in schools than others. They made friends with each other. They spent their out of school time together. Was that the same at your school? And did you look round and think, why isn't everybody else actually doing arts? Why aren't they as keen as me at theatre? And is that perhaps where this idea came from, that you're really passionate about why isn't everybody doing arts?
Yes, definitely you felt that the art class was sort of the outsiders. It was the cast-offs, the drifters, and the obsessive. Yeah,
the misfits. The misfits.
Yes. And yet, even then, that there was this huge film industry, huge theatre industry, huge literature industry. So the creativity of Britain was already not just emerging, but very, very prominent in the world. Nobody ever made the connection for me between the fact that there was this sort of semi-dubious territory of non-academic stuff that you did, both in class and extracurricular, and the fact that, of course, the world relied on this economically as well as creatively. Okay. And when I did kind of click that actually academic had been put into a kind of hierarchical relationship where deep creativity that could be about kinetic relationship or aesthetic understanding or the relationship between sort of space, that was somehow not understood in education as being as valid.
So to some extent it wasn't a golden age for creativity in schools back in the 70s? I
don't think it was. But I tell you what I do think was that, first of all, in Liverpool, which is where I grew up, there was an extraordinary creative community, and an unusual one in the sense that I suppose, you'd had obviously the Beatles, but you also had a very, very strong civic art gallery museum, the poets, the beat poets, you had the Liverpool Philharmonic. And my memory of growing up in Liverpool is that all of those things, classical through to contemporary, were all valued equally. And that actually it wasn't until I left Liverpool that I realised that people thought that classical music was a different race almost from people who like rock music. So
That's very interesting.
Yeah, I felt very fortunate to grow up in a community that had a much greater sense of shared values of creativity. And that's where I felt that it was an exciting place. Not so much in school.
It's probably the answer to the question I was going to ask next, in that when you wanted to go to university to do drama, I suppose there's many a parent would have said, why don't you do something that's more likely to guarantee you a good job with a good income, particularly as you were that group that's the first in the family to go to university. What was it like in your family when you said, I'm determined I want to go to Birmingham and I want to do drama?
Well, it's a good question, because certainly lawyer, doctor, all of the things that I know.
Anything but drama, almost.
Other generations coming in. I mean, I know that particularly, for Asian girls, for example, drama isn't something they necessarily want to tell their parents they want to do, because they could be lawyers or teachers. But I think that I've been doing this since I was 5. I've been entering all kinds of competitions. I've been winning medals. I was so clearly committed. I think my parents thought, well, she'll be unhappy unless she doesn't do this. And of course, I did have this fantastic head teacher who was very supportive, and who made it clear to my parents that it wasn't going to be easy. I had to get 4 A-levels. I had to have Latin O-level, which I didn't take at O-level, so I had to I had to take it as part of my A-level group as well. So I think they began to realise that I would still have a degree, and in that phrase,
it wasn't a soft option.
Yeah, and you could always fall back on it, sort of territory. But I was determined never to fall back on it, and that's one of the reasons I never learnt to type as well, because that was the era when if you learnt to type, you'd end up being somebody's PA.
Yes.
So I refused. I refused fallback options, and I still can't type, which is now a huge disadvantage. But I also began to have a sense that if I didn't defend my creative space, not many other people would. And I began to think of myself, I suppose, as one of a group of people who had to take responsibility for my life, And if I had these values that creativity had worth, I had to speak of that.
But it is that drive and commitment. I mean, one thing's interesting looking through your whole career, that you might have, I mean, you've run some immensely important arts organisations and you've become a big figure, but you've always, I suppose, to some extent, kept faith with being a campaigner for what happens in our schools. Why is arts in education, in schools, so important to you even now?
Well, I think that if I hadn't had the opportunity to do the arts and hadn't been encouraged, I think my energy would definitely have turned into something very negative. I mean, I was already dabbling with things that weren't going to be helpful to my future. And, you know, that would have been a crisis for me. And I see that, and that's me from a supportive background.
Yeah. Yes, how much more difficult,
you know,
for children.
I see over and over and over again in all the work I've ever done that when people have an opportunity to express who they are, either imaginatively or factually through creative work, it's totally liberating. And they imagine a different being than the one that they are. They can see new possibilities for themselves, and they change their way of being. And I just can't imagine why we are not offering that to all children. I mean, they're entitled to it. It's an actual human right. And you know, the Declaration of Human Rights includes the right to art. And for me, the fact that we only attend to that as almost a kind of passive activity, i.e., you know, sure, you can go to the theatre, that's just not good enough. So I've witnessed, not just with young people, but with older people as well, this moment when a door opened, they went through it, and they were able to change their own lives. And I think that this constant underestimating of what the imagination can do for people is well, I think we'll look back on it in 100 years' time and be horrified. You know, once upon a time, people believed that not everyone would ever read and write, and that it wasn't even an entitlement. And now, of course, we're deeply concerned by levels of literacy. I feel this is true of creativity. And like literacy and numeracy, they're entitled to have it disciplined and honed and developed, and not to do that is wrong.
Let's move to 1999, and when you were part of the group under Sir Ken Robinson that produced the creativity report for shorthand to the Labour government of the time. Now, I remember reading that report when it was produced, and one of the things that struck me was when we talk about creativity, we slip into talking about teaching art and drama and music, whereas what you were talking about was a creative school, a creative institution, teaching English and maths and science in a creative way. Why aren't we creative institutions? Teachers are creative people. They create every day because they spend their day engaging with children of different ages. So what did you find were the blocks to schools being creative institutions?
What we found was that basically teachers were scared. They had been encouraged to feel that their job was to line somebody up and head them for an exam. And then get them there. And the increase in pressure of league tables had driven that proposition even further.
Some teachers in some schools do manage to fight their way out of that system, don't they?
Yes. Well, when we were doing that particular report, we took evidence from many head teachers who were doing brilliant work. And of course, it does have to come from the head, I think, for it to be consistent.
It's a chance whether your child happens to go to one of those schools to some extent.
But those heads who had taken that step and said, yes, my school is going to be a creative school, their results were better, the staff were happier, the pupils were happier, etc. And they basically very overtly said, we do this despite what we're told, and because our results are good, we're left alone. Now, I think with the music manifesto, with creative partnerships, there are lots of things that have changed in schools, but it's still, to me, is about an individual head teacher having to take that courageous step to be a bit different. And I think that, like the health service, there's an entitlement to less patchiness. And I think if we're able to validate the creative school, then we should now be aiming to say, well, how do we roll that out?
Okay. One of the ways in which we might do that, I want to turn now to sort of teaching of the arts, that bit of the curriculum, because we do still divide it, although perhaps we shouldn't. I feel more and more every day, I think, that those subjects can only be taught effectively if we use the arts organisations, both nationally and in the wider community, to help that. Because I tell you what the risk is always, and I know this won't happen with you, the risk is always that arts institutions do that when they've got the time and the money. But the minute the going gets tough or the budget gets cut, it's the first to go. And there's a very strong feeling that's not going to happen at the South Bank Centre. So just tell us a little bit about what's going on there.
Okay, well, I think that, I mean, when we reopened the festival hall, we were in some respects reawakening the entire site, which is 21 acres. And I was very inspired, still am very inspired, by the Festival of Britain and the 1951 agenda that they set out. Because that was that post-war moment. I mean, my father was in Bomber Command. Yes. I think of those 17-year-olds going off to fight for freedom and coming back and saying, what society do we want? Yes. Welfare, education, health, and creativity. And they took that space and said, we'll use the phrase of the war artists, the propaganda of the imagination. I still think that we are trying to catch up with that idealism again. So the South Bank Centre's commitment is to try to make the South Bank Centre almost like a creative campus. I've always had this dream, actually, that in a sense the non-school could exist in our public spaces. Instead of children feeling as if their entire life is in this other place called school, that actually an awful lot of their life
leaks out of the buildings.
I think it should be in and amongst the civic buildings that we have as our society. I think they should merge and fuse.
There'll be some children in the South Bank who will be there every day. You know it. They are the ones. They are you of 20, 30 years ago. How successful are you being with those who don't naturally gravitate to what you offer? I mean, I suppose in that journey of arts for everyone, how much further are you pushing it along so that you do involve all those kids in the south of the river?
Well, I think that there are lots of kids, provided you get involved in their interest, that immediately befriend you and want it if they know it is for them. I think that the really complex areas of child neglect and the sort of hostility and isolation that children can have when they have multiple problems domestically, those are things which the arts can tackle, but you need very, very careful surroundings for that to happen in. So, and I believe we should be looking at the arts to remedy some of those issues for young people too. But leaving that aside for a minute, the vast majority of children who perhaps don't define themselves as particularly academic, but are there as vigorous young citizens, what they need from the arts is a sense that the thing that excites them, let's say it's hip hop for a minute. I mean, it's a very sort of obvious thing to say, but we're doing something at the moment called the B-Girls, which is hip hop music and dance for girls, because it's traditionally all that rapping and so on. It's very male imagery, lots of young men, lots of bad imagery actually, verbally about women's status. So we've been doing this huge celebration of girls and hip hop. Provided these girls realise that not only is it exciting for them, but also there's a lot of discipline attached, that they can work with great artists from America, they can really learn how to dance and rap and musical form. It's very, very quick for them to then start being interested in slam poetry. It's quick for them to get involved in the idea of rhythm in other forms.
And you can offer that because you've got a
big arts complex.
A multidisciplinary site, I suppose, yes.
And I mean, I'm really not interested in trapping children into the denominator, the lowest denominator that they happen to have found themselves in at that time. Because one of the things that has been key to me is the fact that creativity demands rigour. Yes. And it's about time and process. It's about particular moments of expertise being revealed at whatever level you're at it, and then it's the next challenge. Like sport,
You're talking about influence the children, and presumably you've got a brilliant opportunity to influence the teachers as well. I mean, we mentioned earlier briefly the lack of creativity and initial teacher training these days. So presumably you're working with schools, working with not just drama teachers, arts teachers, but all sorts of teachers, and you're central to that as well.
We're trying to bring schools in residence as well, so that you might have a whole school in residence with you for a whole term. And that would mean that you could do cross-generational work, you could do cross-disciplinary work with a number of teachers, and I think one of the things that's become important in all walks of life is this whole issue of leadership. The teacher is the leader that most young people get to know. But if that leader is nervous, insecure, lacking courage, timidity, I think, is the death of many things. Yeah. So I think what we're trying to do with teachers is give them more frameworks in which to be more courageous.
You've talked a lot about leadership, and although you are not a trained teacher, you're not a head teacher, you have led arts and you've worked with children and you've worked with the community. You look around a school today, how would you change it? Would you change the timetable? Would you change who you had teaching? How would your school look different to make it a creative institution?
Okay, well, whatever I describe, I have to say in advance that I'm sure there are many schools doing
bits of it,
yeah.
Yes.
If not all of it, because there are brilliant teachers out there. But I would say that, first of all, I would have a lot more non-teachers working alongside teachers, a lot more artists and scientists, working in schools, so practitioners. I would break the timetable up very differently, probably. So, for example, I know that to do proper process of some kinds of creativity, you need a long period without a bell going. And then for other things, and this might divide up into types of people, I could have done with 10 minutes of maths where they say, look, just learn this one thing, and this is how you can learn it. It could be with quotes, or, you'll learn it like this. And I would have been able to, if I'd found an exciting way of doing it, I could have learnt maths through sport, and I've seen it done, and I could do that. So I think I would have multiple choice types of ways of learning going on for the subject matters, so that children could make the choice like they do for their school menu, whether they wanted to learn maths half an hour, 10 minutes, a full hour, and how they wanted to learn. So more choice about the method of engagement.
And can that still be done with the accountability that schools necessarily must have? We can never now go away from giving information about school performance to parents and the wider community, but you don't think that they're in opposition? I mean, both those things can be done. We can be an accountable education system and still exercise that level of creativity.
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, that's not a difficult...
But I think that's what makes some schools nervous. It makes government nervous.
Yeah.
If we do that, how will we remain accountable?
But all that I understand about people going on sort of creative journeys as groups and then coming back to learn together and then going away again and then coming back to learn together is that actually you get a lot more fuel and motivation going on, and a lot more energy. So I think if you test that, you'll find that the average alertness has gone up considerably. So I just think people are frightened of doing something very different because they're frightened of failing. Of course, we're all frightened of failing, right. But you have to try it out. What else would I change? Well, I mean, I used to go on lots of school visits when I was young, and I remember that then came a period when there were like no school visits practically, partly because of finance.
Back to that teacher strike and finance as well.
Yeah, I think that's got to change again, and I think it is changing. But I would say that quite a bit of the school week ought to be in exploration somewhere else. So for example, I know at the South Bank, they can learn about cooking, they can learn about VAT, they can learn about selling and marketing, they can learn about electrics. I mean, why learn those things in a classroom? Why not learn them on a campus like the South Bank
Centre?
Centre?
Motivating people, really, isn't it? Some people are motivated in very different settings.
Yes.
Move on just briefly to another thing that may help schools. You'll tell us, and that's the Olympics 2012. I mean, there's a number of issues here, but to begin with, you took on the post of chair of the Education and Culture Committee, which I still think a lot of people don't really realise that as part of the bid to host the Olympics, we have to say what we will do for culture and education. How will it affect schools? The average, it's not just going to be a visit to the south of London to see the Olympics. It's got to be more than that, hasn't it, for the kids in 2012? So how do you see it affecting them? Well,
at a very basic level, of course, 2012 will send out things like teachers' packs with history and information, all that, but that's the absolutely very rudimentary stuff, isn't it? We want to see whether schools can create their own festivals, their own festivals of ceremony, their own festivals of ritual, their own relays, their own cultural Olympiads, because each Olympics, when it's given to a city, they have an option to do a 4-year cultural Olympiad. A bit of a mouthful as a term. But what it really means is how do you celebrate the way that your country is? And the way of celebration is always cultural, isn't it? The way people sing, the way people eat.
It's the way they tell stories, that's right.
Yeah. Yes. I think that the Olympics must be a celebration of individual journey. Whether it's the journey towards the tape that's the 100-metre dash, or the journey towards the tape that's one of your fears that you need to get over. It's important that young people can use the Olympics symbolically as well as actually. I think each school can do an enormous range of things with the Olympics, both as a sort of poetic proposition and as an actual thing. I do believe that it's an opportunity for sporties and arties to come together. If we want a really creative, intelligent, healthy, happy nation, I think that the role of sport and art need to be very, very strongly fused into that life, and they shouldn't be put in opposition with each other. And it's up to politicians to allow them to share the stage together. So just mention them in the same breath would be my advice.
Yes. And I think it's interesting from our conversation, it's been both one of frustration and optimism. We talked about lots of interesting things that are happening, perhaps seeds that have been sown, creative partnerships, South Bank, what the museums and galleries are doing.
Yes.
Schools, are you an optimist? How far along that journey are we to putting creativity at the centre of what we do and delivering arts for everyone?
Well, I am optimistic. I mean, I think I've seen, since I sort of grew up in Liverpool, language about creativity and arts and access to all become fulsome and widespread. So I am optimistic, and I also think that the changing nature of participation through the internet is driving young people to form new communities collegiately across the world where they do create and participate. If you look at MySpace, if you look at YouTube, if you look at any of these things, you cannot stop young people creating. And the big thing, I think, is to take all that they're doing now outside of school and drive it back into school life. And I think that will be an amazing thing that happens.
Thank you. On that note of optimism, Jude, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.